The dust of a dry July hung thick in the air at the McLean County Equipment Auction, a fine, gritty powder that coated every truck, every farmer, and every hope. It was 1973, a year of promise when corn was king and the black dirt of central Illinois was as good as gold. For most men there, the auction was a social event, a place to kick tires on machinery they didn't need and talk about the price of soybeans, which was climbing to heights no one had ever seen. For me, Frank Miller, it was business. I stood with my boy David, his 10-year-old hands tucked into the back pockets of his jeans, his eyes wide, taking in the spectacle. He was watching the auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Slim, whose rhythmic chant was a language all its own. But my eyes were fixed on Lot 47. She was a Massey Harris 21A, a self-propelled combine from the mid-50s, parked at the far end of the line, away from the gleaming new paint jobs and the big iron. Her original red paint was faded to a dull, sun-bleached orange, streaked with rust where the rain had run down her sheet metal for 2 decades. The canvas on her pickup reel was torn and mildewed. One of the big front drive tires was cracked clean through to the cord. She wasn't much to look at. To most, she was a parts machine, a resident of the Fence Row boneyard. To me, she had good bones. "What are you looking at that old relic for, Frank?" a voice boomed behind me. I didn't have to turn around. It was Rich Henderson. Rich was the new face of farming in our parts. Young, ambitious, with a smile full of teeth and a handshake that always felt like he was measuring you up. He'd just bought the old Peterson place, leveraged to the hilt with a loan from the Production Credit Association, and the first thing he did was bulldoze the old barn and put up a Morton building big enough to house an airplane. I turned slowly. "Afternoon, Rich." He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was supposed to seem friendly but felt more like a claim of territory. "You're not seriously thinking of bidding on that thing, are you? My God, the scrapyard might give you $50 for it." He let out a loud laugh that made a few other farmers turn and look. His new John Deere 6600 combine had been delivered just last week. The whole town knew about it. $60,000 of the newest, most advanced harvesting technology money could buy. It had a 6-row corn head, a diesel engine that purred like a giant cat, and an air-conditioned cab with a radio. The bank owned every last bolt, but to hear Rich talk, you'd think he paid for it in cash. "She's got a Continental Flathead 6 in her," I said, ignoring his jab. "Same engine they put in the old cockshut 30s. Simple, reliable." Rich scoffed. "Simple and reliable don't get the crop in before the first snow, Frank. Speed does. Capacity does. My 6600 can do in one afternoon what that thing would take a week to finish. You got to keep up with the times." "The times change," I said, turning back to the Massey. David looked up at me, a worried crease in his brow. He could feel the tension, the unspoken judgment in the air. Slim, the auctioneer, finally made his way down the line to Lot 47. He barely gave it a glance. "All right, boys, what am I bid for this? Classic piece of agricultural history. Who'll give me $100 to start it off? $100? Do I hear 100? Silence. A few guys chuckled. Rich Henderson folded his arms, a smug look on his face. $50. Slim tried again, his voice losing its rhythm. $50 to haul it away. I raised a hand. 200. A few heads turned in my direction. Slim's eyes lit up. "I got 200 from Frank Miller. Who'll give 250? 250. Another farmer, an old-timer named Gus, gave me a pitying look and raised his finger. 250. He was probably bidding on it for parts for his own aging machine. 300, I said, my voice steady. 350, Gus countered. We went back and forth like that, in $50 increments, the bids crawling upward while the crowd grew restless. When the price hit 600, Gus shook his head and backed off. $600 going once, Slim chanted, getting his rhythm back. Going twice. 650, a new voice called out. It was one of Rich Henderson's hired hands. Rich stood behind him, whispering in his ear with that same smug grin. He wasn't trying to buy it. He was just running up the price on me for sport. 700, I said immediately, my voice hard as flint. I looked straight at Rich. The grin on his face faltered for just a second. He hadn't expected me to have the sand for it. He said something to his man, who shook his head. Rich waved a dismissive hand at the auctioneer. $700 it is, Slim shouted, happy to be done with it. Sold to Frank Miller for $700. A fine piece of iron, Frank, a fine piece. The other farmers started to move on, talking in low murmurs. I heard the word fool more than once. Rich walked over, shaking his head in mock disbelief. Well, Frank, you sure showed me. For $700, you could have bought yourself a new set of tires for your tractor. Instead, you bought a monument to 1955. He laughed again and walked away toward the concession stand, the hero of his own story. I ignored him and walked up to the old combine, placing a hand on the faded red fender. The metal was warm from the sun. David came and stood beside me. "Dad, why did Mr. Henderson make fun of it?" he asked, his voice small. I knelt down and looked him in the eye. "Because, son, he doesn't understand. He sees a pile of rust. I see potential. He sees slow. I see steady. His new machine is owned by the bank. Every time it rains, every time a part breaks, he's got a man in a suit breathing down his neck. This machine," I said, patting the fender, "it owes no man a dime, and every part in it I can fix with my own 2 hands. That's a different kind of freedom, David, the kind they don't teach you about in business school." I paid Slim in cash from a worn leather wallet, 35 $20 bills I'd earned with sweat and saved with discipline. Then I went to get my tractor. My main workhorse was a 1952 Farmall M, my father's tractor. I'd overhauled the engine myself 2 winters ago, and its 4-cylinder gasoline engine started with a familiar, comforting bark. We hitched the old Massey to the drawbar with a heavy chain and began the slow, clanking journey home. The 5 miles back to our farm felt like a parade of shame. Cars slowed down to stare, farmers stopped their pickups to watch the spectacle of the old M pulling the even older combine. I could see them shaking their heads, their faces a mixture of pity and scorn. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the fields of waist-high corn, I wasn't thinking about them. I was thinking about the work ahead. I was thinking about the solid feel of that old steel and the quiet satisfaction of bringing something forgotten back to life. Before we get to the part where I fire that old Continental engine up for the first time, I have to ask you folks listening. Have you ever bought a piece of old iron that everyone else called junk, but you knew it had good bones? Maybe it was a tractor, a truck, or even just an old tool. Let me know down in the comments what it was, and if you managed to prove them all wrong. The rest of that summer was a blur of grease, sweat, and long hours under the bare bulbs of my workshop. The Massey Harris 21A sat in the center of the concrete floor like a patient on an operating table. David became my shadow, my apprentice. He'd sit on an overturned bucket, handing me wrenches, cleaning parts in a pan of kerosene, and listening. He learned the difference between a box end and an open-end wrench, the feel of a properly torqued bolt, and the specific smell of 90-weight gear oil. First came the engine. The Continental F226 was a simple, tough-as-nails flathead 6-cylinder, but 2 decades of sitting had taken their toll. I pulled the head, a heavy chunk of cast iron, and we peered down into the cylinders. There was a ridge of carbon at the top of each one, but the walls themselves looked surprisingly clean. No deep scores, no signs of a broken ring. The old farmer who'd owned it must have taken decent care of it before parking it in the weeds. "See this, David?" I said, running my finger along the top of a cylinder. "That little lip there is from wear. We need to ream that out before we can get the pistons out." We spent a whole Saturday on it. I used a ridge reamer, carefully turning the handle, shaving off a fine spiral of metal and carbon until the ridge was gone. Then, working from underneath, we pushed out the pistons one by one. I showed David how to check the rings, how they were stuck in their grooves, caked with old burnt oil. We cleaned everything. The pistons, the connecting rods, the block itself. We spent hours with wire brushes and scrapers and cans of solvent until our hands were stained black and the old iron started to show its true self again. I took the head to a machine shop in town to have it magnafluxed for cracks and planed flat. While it was gone, I honed the cylinders myself with a ball hone on my electric drill, the stones buzzing as they spun, creating a perfect crosshatch pattern on the cylinder walls for the new rings to seat against. A new set of rings, bearings, and a full gasket kit cost me a little over $100 from the Napa store. It was money well spent. While the engine was apart, we moved on to the rest of the machine. The variable speed drive, a clever system of expanding and contracting pulleys that controlled the ground speed, was a marvel of simple engineering. But the main V-belt was frayed and cracked. I found a replacement in an industrial supply catalogue. We drained the gearbox and the final drives, flushing out the milky, water-contaminated oil and refilling it with fresh lubricant. We pulled every bearing we could get to, cleaning and repacking them with thick, waterproof grease. The talk at the co-op elevator was relentless. "Heard Frank Miller's trying to resurrect that old Massey junker," one guy would say. "Yeah, my grandpa had one of those. Spent more time fixing it than running it," another would add. Rich Henderson would just lean against the counter, sipping a Coke, and say, "Some folks just can't let go of the past. Farming's a business now. You got to be efficient." They didn't see the education my son was getting. They didn't understand the deep satisfaction of knowing a machine down to its last cotter pin. To them, efficiency meant writing a check. To me, it meant knowing how to fix what you owned. One evening, Rich drove by our place, not in his pickup, but in his brand new John Deere 4430 tractor. He wasn't going anywhere, just driving. The turbo on its diesel engine whistled a high, powerful song, a sound of progress and debt. He slowed down as he passed our workshop, the open door spilling yellow light into the dusk. I was underneath the Massey, tightening the bolts on the oil pan. David was sitting on the floor, carefully cleaning spark plugs. Rich just shook his head and drove on, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled over my own quiet work. "Why's he always bothering us, Dad?" David asked, his voice echoing slightly in the big shed. "He's not bothering us, son," I said, my voice muffled by the machinery. "He's bothering himself. He's got to prove to everyone, and mostly to himself, that he made the right choice. People who are sure of themselves don't need to spend so much time telling you you're wrong." The day the cylinder head came back from the shop was a milestone. We carefully placed the new gasket, coated with a thin layer of copper sealant, onto the block. We lowered the heavy head into place and began the meticulous process of torquing the head bolts in the correct sequence, starting from the center and working our way out in a spiral. A few days later, the engine was fully assembled. We filled the radiator with fresh coolant and the crankcase with new 30-weight oil. The moment of truth arrived on a humid August afternoon. I had David stand back. I checked the fuel line one last time, pulled the choke, and hit the starter button. The starter groaned, turning the engine over slowly. It coughed once, a puff of black smoke coming from the exhaust pipe. It turned over again, then again. And then it caught. The Continental flathead sputtered to life, running rough at first, then settling into a low, surprisingly smooth rumble. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of a modern diesel. It was a deeper, throatier sound, the sound of an engine with history. The clatter of the valve train, the whir of the belts, the hum of the threshing cylinder, it was a mechanical symphony. A small victory, yes, but it was ours. We had taken a piece of forgotten iron, a joke at an auction, and we had given it a heartbeat again. The real test, the harvest, was still to come. But in that moment, with the smell of exhaust filling the workshop and the floor vibrating beneath my feet, I knew we had a fighting chance. The autumn of 1973 was a gift. The rains came when we needed them, and the sun shone bright and hot the rest of the time. The corn grew tall and the bean pods swelled, heavy with promise. Across the county, you could hear the roar of new combines. Rich Henderson was the king of the harvest. His John Deere 6600, with its air-conditioned cab and 6-row head, devoured his fields. He ran from sunup to sundown, lights blazing into the night. Every trip to the elevator was a victory lap in his new Chevy pickup, the grain tickets piling up on his dashboard. My harvest was a different affair. The Massey Harris 21A, with its little 2-row corn head, felt like a rowboat in an ocean of corn. It was slow. The cab was just a canvas roof to keep the sun off, and the dust was so thick I had to wear a bandana over my face like an old-time outlaw. We didn't have a radio, just the steady thrum of the flathead engine and the rhythmic clatter of the gathering chains. We had breakdowns, A drive belt snapped one afternoon, and we spent 2 hours replacing it with the spare I'd bought. A bearing on the straw walker went out, and we had to shut down for a day while I drove to Peoria to find a replacement at an industrial supply house. Each time the neighbors would see the combine sitting silent in the field, and the rumors would start up again at the coffee shop. "See? Told you that old thing wouldn't last." But here was the difference. When my belt snapped, it cost me $12 and 2 hours of my own time. When the bearing went out, it cost me $30 and a day of lost work. Later that fall, a hydraulic pump failed on Rich Henderson's brand new 6600. The dealer had to send a mechanic out from 2 counties over. The part alone was over $500, and with the service call and 2 days of downtime during peak harvest, Rich lost thousands. I saw him at the parts store, his face pale with stress, his usual bravado gone. He was just a man writing a very large check he couldn't afford. By the time the snow flew, I had my crop in. My yields weren't record-breaking, but they were solid, and more importantly, my costs were a fraction of my neighbors'. I didn't have a $5,000 payment to the bank due on December 1st. The money I made from my grain was mine. I paid my property taxes, bought our groceries, put a healthy sum into a savings account at the local bank, and still had enough left over to buy my wife a new sewing machine for Christmas. We lived simply, but we lived without the crushing weight of debt. The next few years followed that same pattern. The mid-70s were the golden age for farmers. Grain prices stayed high, fueled by massive exports to the Soviet Union. Land values skyrocketed. It seemed like the good times would never end. Rich Henderson embodied the era. He used his profits not to pay down his debt, but as collateral to borrow more. He bought the 80 acres that bordered my farm to the south, paying a price per acre that made old-timers gasp. He traded in his 4430 for a new, bigger 4630. He put up another grain bin, the biggest in the township, its silver dome gleaming in the sun like a monument to his success. He was featured in the local paper, hailed as a progressive young farmer, the future of American agriculture. Meanwhile, I just kept on. I farmed my same quarter section. I maintained my old equipment. The Farmel M still did all my planting and tillage. The Massey 21A, now with a few patches and welds but running better than ever, brought in the harvest each fall. In the community's eyes, I was falling further and further behind. I was the stubborn fool who was missing the opportunity of a lifetime. At church potlucks, people would look at my simple clothes and my wife's homemade dress, then glance over at Rich and his wife, dressed in the latest fashions, and they'd shake their heads. They didn't see our lack of debt. They saw our lack of ambition. One afternoon at the grain elevator, the contrast was laid bare for everyone to see. Rich pulled up in a brand new 3/4-ton Ford pickup, the engine so quiet you could barely hear it run. He hopped out, talking loudly on a new CB radio he'd had installed, boasting about his yields. I pulled in a few minutes later in my old 1965 Ford F100, its engine rumbling, a patch of Bondo on the passenger side door. I got out, gave a quiet nod to the scale operator, and waited my turn. Rich saw me and sauntered over. "Still driving this old thing, Frank?" he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "A man making the kind of money we are these days ought to treat himself to something new." "She gets me where I need to go, Rich," I said, "and she's paid for." He just laughed, a booming, confident sound that echoed off the tall concrete silos. "Paid for? Frank, you got to think bigger. You use debt as a tool, leverage. That's how you get ahead." He clapped me on the back again. "You're a good farmer, Frank, but you're stuck in the past. This boom isn't going to last forever. You got to get big while the getting's good." That night, I sat at the kitchen table with my wife, Mary, going over the farm accounts in a simple ledger book. The numbers were good. Our savings were growing. We were secure. But outside, the world was changing. The news on the radio was all about inflation. The price of everything, fuel, fertilizer, seed, was going up. And the Federal Reserve, the man on the radio said, was going to have to raise interest rates to cool things down. "You hear what Rich said today?" I asked Mary, not looking up from the ledger. "I can imagine," she said softly, her hands busy mending a pair of David's jeans. "Don't you let him get to you, Frank. We're doing just fine." "I know," I said, "but he's right about one thing. These good times, they don't last forever. Trees don't grow to the sky. The last I saw of Rich that fall, he was at the John Deere dealership, standing beside a brand new 7700 turbo combine. It was a monster, bigger and more powerful than anything the world had ever seen. The salesman had him mesmerized, pointing out all the new features. Rich had a dreamy look on his face, the look of a man who believed his own legend. He was signing papers when I left, a wide, confident smile on his face. Back in my own workshop, under the steady glow of a single light bulb, I started my winter maintenance. I drained the oil from the Massey's flathead engine, pulled the spark plugs to check their color, and began the slow, patient work of greasing every zerk, checking every belt, and getting my old, reliable, paid-for steel ready for whatever the next year would bring. I had a feeling it was going to be a year of reckoning. The good years rolled on, one after another, like smooth blacktop under a new truck's tires. The late 70s were a fever dream of high prices and easy credit. Land that my father had bought for $200 an acre was now selling for $3,000, and the banks were lining up to lend against it. Rich Henderson was riding the crest of that wave. His new John Deere 7700 Turbo was the talk of the county. It was a magnificent beast, its green paint gleaming, the turbo whining a song of pure power as it cut an 8-row swath through his corn. He'd torn down his old farmhouse and built a new brick ranch-style home, the kind you saw in magazines, with a 2-car garage and a paved driveway. He was the very picture of modern success. I kept my head down. My son David was in high school now, tall and strong, his hands as capable as my own. He spent his summers and weekends with me, learning the rhythms of the land and the language of old machinery. He understood the difference between the rumble of the Farmall M's engine when it was pulling a heavy plow and the lighter hum it made cultivating young soybeans. He could set the clearances on the Massey's threshing cylinder by sound and feel alone. We were a team, and our little farm, free and clear of debt, was our fortress. The first tremor came in the winter of 1979. The news came over the crackling AM radio in the workshop as I was replacing the sickle sections on the Massey's grain platform. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. In response, President Carter announced an embargo on grain sales. Just like that, our biggest customer was gone. The market panicked. The price of corn, which had been flirting with $4 a bushel, collapsed overnight. The mood at the co-op turned sour. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a low-grade anxiety. Men who had been bragging about their expansion plans were now talking in hushed tones about their operating loans for the spring. Rich Henderson was there, his usual bravado ringing hollow. "It's a temporary setback," he announced to anyone who would listen. "A political game. The markets will bounce back by summer. The smart money is doubling down." But his eyes were tight with worry. He had storage bins full of last year's crop, thousands of bushels he'd been holding, speculating that the price would go even higher. Now he was trapped. That spring, the sky turned against us. A long, stubborn drought settled over the Midwest. The rain just stopped. Day after day, a merciless sun beat down from a hazy white sky. The fields turned the color of ash. The young corn, which should have been knee-high by the 4th of July, was stunted and yellow, its leaves rolling up tight like cigars to conserve what little moisture they had. Every afternoon, dark clouds would build on the western horizon, promising relief, only to dissipate into nothing before they reached us. The drought put a strain on everything, man and machine. The fine, abrasive dust got into every bearing, every filter, every moving part. Modern, high-strung machines felt it the worst. Their complex hydraulic systems, sensitive to the slightest contamination, began to fail. Their turbocharged engines, designed to run at peak power, overheated in the blistering heat. Rich's new 7700 was his biggest problem. During the short, disappointing wheat harvest, it started acting up. An electronic sensor that monitored the tailings return auger kept shutting the whole machine down. The dealer's mechanic came out 3 times, a young kid who knew more about computer diagnostics than he did about turning a wrench. He'd plug in his little black box, scratch his head, replace a part that cost $400, and leave. An hour later, the same warning light would flash, and the combine would grind to a halt again. I saw the problem one afternoon when I drove past. Rich was standing in his wheat field, his hands on his hips, staring at the silent green machine. The mechanic's truck was there, its hood up. I pulled over. "Trouble?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Rich barely looked at me. His face was slick with sweat and frustration. "It's this damn computer," he spat. "Says the auger is overloaded when it's running empty. Kid from the dealership has swapped out every sensor on the thing. Now he thinks it's the main control module. $1,000, and it's on back order from Moline." I walked over and looked at the tailings elevator. "Did you check the wiring harness?" "The kid did," Rich snapped. "He says the computer shows it's fine." I pointed to a spot where the harness ran along a frame member tucked behind a hydraulic line. "That dust is like sandpaper. It can rub through the insulation on a wire just enough to cause a short when it vibrates. The computer can't always see that. You gotta look with your eyes." He stared at the spot, then back at me. For a moment I saw the ambitious young man disappear, replaced by a tired, overwhelmed farmer. He didn't say thank you. He just grunted and turned back to the machine. I got in my truck and drove away. 2 days later, I saw the combine running again. My own harvest that fall was grim. The corn yields were less than half of what they should have been. The beans were small and shriveled in the pods. But the old Massey just kept chugging along. One hot afternoon, the flathead engine started to run a little rough. I stopped, pulled a spark plug, and saw it was fouled. A simple fix. I spent 20 minutes cleaning the plugs and adjusting the carburetor's fuel mixture to lean it out a bit for the hot, thin air. Then I was running again. The cost of the repair was zero. The cost of the knowledge was a lifetime of experience. The numbers I wrote in my ledger that winter were small, but they were black. I didn't make much money, but I didn't lose any either. The fortress was holding. For Rich Henderson and others like him, the drought and the price collapse were the first cracks in a foundation built on debt. The real earthquake was yet to come. The new decade began with a death blow. To fight the runaway inflation that had plagued the country, the Federal Reserve, under its new chairman, Paul Volcker, jacked up interest rates to levels no one had ever seen. The prime rate, the number the banks based all their loans on, soared past 20%. For farmers who had financed their land and equipment on variable rate loans, it was a catastrophe. Their payments doubled, then tripled, almost overnight. The word foreclosure started to be whispered, then spoken openly at the coffee shop. The first to go were the young guys, the ones who had jumped in at the top of the market. Then, even established, multi-generational farms began to buckle under the strain. Auction notices started appearing in the paper, small black and white ads that read like obituaries for family farms. Rich Henderson fought it as long as he could. He was a proud man. He sold off his new Ford pickup. He let his hired man go. His wife took a job as a clerk in town. But it wasn't enough. The interest on his massive loans was compounding faster than he could ever hope to earn. The shiny equipment, the big grain bins, the new house, they weren't assets anymore, they were millstones dragging him under. The end came in the spring of 1982. A full-page ad in the paper announced the complete liquidation auction of Henderson Farms. The list of equipment was staggering. The 7700 turbo combine, the 4630 tractor, planters, plows, discs, a whole line of late-model machinery that was the envy of the county just a few years before. And at the bottom of the list, 160 acres of prime McLean County farmland to be sold in 2 80-acre tracts. One of those tracts was the 80 acres bordering my farm. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a raw March wind whipping across the yard. The mood was funereal. This wasn't like the auction where I'd bought the Massey. There was no excitement, no friendly competition. It was a wake. Farmers stood in small, quiet groups, their hands in their pockets, their faces grim. They were there to pick over the bones of a fallen neighbor, and they all knew it could just as easily be them. Rich's equipment, once so immaculate, now looked worn and tired. The stress of the last 2 years showed in the dents and scrapes, the hasty repairs made with baling wire and desperation. The auctioneer, a man with a somber face, kept his chant low and businesslike. The prices were heartbreaking. The 7700 combine, which Rich had paid over $100,000 for, sold for $30,000 to a dealer from out of state. The 4630 tractor, barely 5 years old, went for less than half its value. I watched as piece by piece, Rich's dream was dismantled and hauled away for pennies on the dollar. He stood by the side of his new house, his face a stony mask, watching it all burn to the ground. When the auctioneer moved to the land, a hush fell over the crowd. This was the final act. I had talked it over with Mary and David for weeks. We had the money in our savings account. It was a huge step for us, doubling the size of our farm. But the opportunity was there, born of another man's tragedy. I felt a knot in my stomach, but I knew what I had to do. The bidding on the first 80 was slow. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Finally, a lawyer representing the bank started the bidding. A few others joined in. When the bidding stalled, I raised my hand. I made one bid, a fair but not extravagant price, based on what the land could realistically produce, not on the inflated values of the 70s. The auctioneer looked around. No one else moved. "Sold," he said and pointed at me. I didn't look at Rich. I couldn't. I just walked over to the clerk's table, my heart pounding, and signed the papers. I had bought back the land my grandfather had once farmed, the land his own father had lost in the Depression. The cycle had come full circle. My harvest that fall was the biggest of my life. I had twice the acres to cover, but the work felt different. It was the work of a survivor. I hired a neighbor's boy to drive the grain truck, but David and I handled the rest. The Massey 21A, nearly 30 years old now, ran like a top. We had to work from dawn until well after dusk for weeks on end, but the old combine never faltered. Each night, as I shut down the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden silence, I would look out over the fields. My fields, all of them paid for, and feel a profound sense of gratitude. I wasn't rich. I would never be rich. But I was free, and in the farm crisis of the 1980s, that was worth more than all the money in the world. A few weeks after the auction, I saw a pickup I didn't recognize, parked by the side of the road near my new 80. It was an old, beat-up Chevy, its tailgate held on with a bungee cord. A man was leaning against the fence, just looking out at the field where the winter wheat was starting to green up. It was Rich Henderson. He looked different. The confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet weariness. He'd lost weight. He was wearing work boots and worn-out jeans, not the polished boots and crisp shirts he used to favor. I pulled my truck over and got out. For a long moment, we just stood there, the cool spring wind blowing between us. "It's looking good, Frank," he said finally, his voice raspy. "You got the wheat in early." "Had a good window of weather," I said. He kicked at a clod of dirt with the toe of his boot. "I heard you bought it." "I did." He nodded slowly, his eyes still on the field. "I'm glad it was you," he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. "Better you than the bank or some corporation from Chicago." He finally turned to look at me, and his eyes were clear. The bitterness was gone. "You were right, Frank. All those years, I thought you were a fool, stuck in the past. But you weren't stuck. You were anchored. I was the fool. I built a house of cards on a windy day. It was the hardest thing he'd probably ever had to say. My own anger, the resentment I'd held onto for years, just melted away. He wasn't my rival anymore. He was just another farmer who had loved the land and lost it. "What are you doing now, Rich?" I asked. "Driving a truck for the co-op. Long hours, not much pay. But it's a living." He shrugged. "The bank took the house. We're renting a little place in town. It's humbling." An idea had been forming in my mind, and in that moment it solidified. "Listen, Rich," I said, "I could use some help. I've got twice the ground now, and David's thinking of going to college for a couple of years to study agronomy. It's too much for one man to handle right." He looked at me, suspicious. "I can't afford to rent any land, Frank. I've got nothing." "I'm not talking about renting," I said. "I'm talking about a job. Come work for me. I'll pay you a fair wage, and I'll tell you what else. You help me farm this ground, and we'll set aside a portion of the profits from this 80 every year. When there's enough, you can use it as a down payment to buy it back from me, at the same price I paid for it. No interest." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He looked from me to the field, then back again. I saw his eyes well up. He blinked hard and turned away, composing himself. When he looked back, he just nodded, unable to speak. He stuck out his hand, And for the first time, his handshake wasn't a contest. It was a pact. The community had changed its tune. The men who used to laugh at my old Massey were now asking me for advice on how to keep their own aging equipment running. They'd seen too many of their neighbors wiped out by debt. My workshop became a gathering place on rainy days, a school for learning how to make do, how to repair instead of replace. I never preached, I just showed them how to weld a cracked frame or rebuild a carburetor. The lessons of thrift and self-reliance, once seen as relics of the past, were now the keys to survival. Years passed. David went to college, got his degree and came home. He brought new ideas about soil conservation and crop rotation, but he also brought a deep respect for the lessons he'd learned at my side. Rich worked with us side by side for 10 years. He was a good man and a hard worker when he wasn't trying to build an empire. He saved his money, and true to my word, the day came when he bought back his 80 acres. He farmed it with a modest set of used equipment, his ambition now tempered with hard-won wisdom. We were no longer rivals, we were neighbors, in the truest sense of the word. One crisp October evening, long after Rich was back on his own feet, I was out in the field with David. We were finishing the last few rows of soybeans. David was at the wheel of the old Massey Harris. She was over 40 years old now, her faded red paint almost entirely gone, her sheet metal bearing the scars of 4 decades of harvests. But the Continental flathead engine still purred its steady, reliable tune. I was standing in the grain truck, watching the beans pour from the auger, the dust catching the golden light of the setting sun. The air was filled with the rich, earthy smell of the harvest. David shut the machine down, and the sudden quiet settled over the land. He climbed down from the operator's platform, a smear of grease on his cheek. "That's it for another year, Dad," he said, a tired smile on his face. "That's it," I agreed. We stood there for a moment, just looking at the old combine. "You know," David said, "I was thinking today, we could afford a new combine now. A nice one, with a cab and air conditioning." "We could," I said. "But I wouldn't trade this old girl for anything," he said, patting her big drive wheel. "Every time I start this engine, I think about all those years. I think about you and me in the workshop, my hands black with grease. I think about Rich Henderson and his shiny new Deere. This machine, it's more than just steel, isn't it?" I put my arm around my son's shoulders. "It's our story, David," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "It's the story of what it means to be free. It's the proof that it's not about how fast you go or how big you get. It's about finishing the race, with your head held high and your soul your own." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air grew cool. In the distance, the lights of other farms began to wink on, each one a small star in the vast, dark expanse of the prairie. We stood there together, father and son, 2 generations of farmers who had learned the simple, timeless truth that the best things in life are the ones that owe no man a dime.